I'm gonna send you the website so you can register the kids, because if you register them ahead of time, you'll have a t-shirt waiting for that. You know, and one, if you're gonna volunteer.
My name's Frank.
Okay.
Alright. Hello everyone, thank you for being here today. My name is Jonah, and for my independent study mentorship project, I decided to focus on the field of law. And really just to get things going and ease my nerves a little bit, we're going to play a fun trivia game called What's Next? This game is going to include me providing you all a legal scenario, and then you're going to provide an educated guess as to how you believe that's going to play out in a court of law. First, legal scenario number one, we have Mr. Player who's speeding down Days of Allah, and he gets pulled over. So he stops his vehicle, and the police officer opens up his trunk and finds a pound of narcotics. What happens next? Do we believe that Mr. Player is not guilty, guilty, maybe some other scenario?
Guilty. Not guilty.
Guilty.
Not guilty until you prove it.
Well, to start, Mr. Player's case would actually be dismissed in accordance with the exclusionary rule. Remember we said that Mr. Player was initially pulled over for speeding, and therefore the officer had no articulable suspicion or probable cause to open up his trunk.
That's right.
And remember, all citizens are entitled to their Fourth Amendment right of no unreasonable search and seizure. So as long as Mr. Player's attorney is competent, they would file a motion to suppress the evidence, and therefore the case would be dismissed. For legal scenario number two, we're going to continue picking on Mr. Player. Let's say he's driving down Days of Allah, and we get into a motor vehicle accident. And then all of a sudden I start telling Mr. Player, you know what, my neck is really starting to hurt, my back is really starting to hurt, Mr. Player, and it's your fault. So I sue him in a civil case. However, in the civil court, I'm only able to prove that there's a 51% chance that Mr. Player's negligence actually caused bodily harm to me. So what happens next? Do we believe that 51% is enough for me to win the case? Am I going to win the case? Is Mr. Player going to win the case?
Mr. Player's gonna win.
Okay.
It's a 50-50 chance.
Is 51 enough?
Yes.
Preponderance of evidence, right?
Exactly. So, in court, the burden of proof is a legal standard that requires parties to provide evidence to demonstrate that a claim is valid. We're all familiar with beyond a reasonable doubt, or virtually certain, or greater than 95% chance that a defendant's actions actually cause harm to a plaintiff. However, that is almost exclusively for criminal cases. Remember, we are in civil court pertaining to personal injury, and the burden of proof in this case is preponderance of evidence, like Dr. Harrell said, or more likely than not. So all I have to prove essentially in civil court is that there's a greater than 50% chance, therefore 51% is sufficient for me to win the case.
Well said. Good job.
So now we're going to stop picking on Mr. Player, and we're going to discuss a case that my mentor, Mr. Valdez, and I discussed. I'll get into my mentorship a little bit later. And for obvious reasons, I'm going to change the name of this individual. For context, John is a construction worker who works all day, every day in long San Antonio weather. And that's just context. Let's get into the actual scenario. So John, after a long day in construction, was pulled over by SAPD, and in the police report, the officer notes that John has noticeable body odor and can smell the scent of marijuana. Therefore, he has reasonable suspicion to ask John to step out of the vehicle, and upon questioning, John admits that I actually have a bag of marijuana hidden in between my buttocks. Therefore, John is arrested and charged with drug possession. What happens next? Remember, in scenario number one, the officer did not have articulable suspicion or probable cause. However, in this case, the officer claims he does because he could smell the scent of marijuana. Do we believe John is guilty, not guilty? Maybe another scenario that we aren't thinking of.
Guilty.
Guilty? Dr. Harrell?
Guilty.
Guilty? Well, John's case was actually dismissed. Why? Well, Mr. Valdez did not dispute whether or not John actually had drugs on him. He disputed as to whether or not the police officer had articulable suspicion. Remember, we said that John is a construction worker who had worked a long day in San Antonio weather, and obviously it's very hot during the summer. And in the police report, we said that John had a noticeable body odor. So Mr. Valdez contested and questioned, what's the likelihood that a police officer can smell the scent of marijuana hidden in between someone's buttocks on top of an already noticeable body odor? Right? Not very likely. And so he filed a motion to suppress the evidence, which was approved because, again, the court ruled that the officer really did not have articulable suspicion to search the individual, and then he filed in accordance with the exclusionary rule. Thank you everyone for participating. I created this game to showcase some legal terminology and exemplify a couple legal concepts that I learned throughout my independent study mentorship. And now I would like to transition into formally starting this presentation. So for the next 40 to 45 minutes, please bear with me. I'm going to try to keep it as engaging as possible, but I'm going to cover the following topics. First, ISM. Explain what the course is. What does ISM even stand for? And then we're going to transition into my mentorship. Unfortunately, Mr. Valdez is not here today, but I was mentored throughout the year by Mr. Eduardo O'Connor Valdez. Then I'm going to provide a fun case study lesson, and then we're going to transition into my product, enhancing legal awareness, and then provide a reflection of my overall experience.
I'm sorry, honey.
It's okay.
You're fine. Who's this? Oh, in the seat. I'm sorry.
But before I thoroughly detail my ISM experience, I would like to provide you some context about my ambition and source of interest in law. And I think the best way of doing that is by providing a story of my educational journey. First and foremost, I want to go back to where it all started, elementary school career day. Imagine that all your friends are dressed up in typical things as a child, such as a firefighter, a doctor, and then there's me, as I'm the only student aspiring to be an attorney in a little suit and little mini briefcase. However, when I was little, my naive goal had no true foundation, no clear outline, no real path of, okay, what exactly even is an attorney? What does their everyday activities even look like? And then that brings us to middle school and the early parts of high school, where I was always asked simple questions like, what do you want to do after high school? Who is someone you look up to? Where do you want to go to college? What's your intended major? And it wasn't until my junior year and senior years of high school that I began to realize that these questions that start with what, how, and who are not only surface level, but restrictive of my thinking. Yes, I always gravitated towards the role of being an attorney, but I think the most important question I needed to ask myself was, why? Sorry, this clicker is. Why do you want to do what you want to do? Why do you even want to go to college? It's always easy to shy away from questions like why, because the answer is not always so clear. Asking why forced me to dig deeper into my purpose, and within this presentation, I'm going to share with you today what I've learned so far by constantly asking myself why. Why, Jonah? Why do you want to be an attorney? Why do you think on top of 4 years in undergraduate school to go through another 3 years of rigorous law school in addition to rigorous preparation for a JD to pass the bar exam? Why is that all worth it? Why is it even important? And fortunately, the opportunities that I had through ISM or independent study mentorship, which I'm going to speak of in a few minutes, really facilitated a personal discovery that enabled me to realize the true source of my interest in the field of law. Ultimately, I believe the rigor of legal education has the potential to foster my self-critical and creative mindset and allow a buildup of knowledge that can be utilized towards helping disadvantaged communities by serving as a lawyer that protects them from aligned interests and offers them an opportunity to having true legal justice. Furthermore, I'm even considering to work in governance and possibly work towards achieving success by implementing innovative resolutions into law at an institutional level. Okay, so now that I've provided some background information about my ambition and interest in the field of law, I'm going to explain what the ISM course entails. ISM is an opportunity for high-achieving juniors and seniors to take an honors independent study course. Throughout this course, I conducted an 8-month in-depth study of an area of special interest under the guidance of an expert from that particular field. It's very wordy, but essentially, since I'm passionate about law, I decided to have a mentor who was naturally an attorney. There are 3 main components to ISM: mentorship, independent research, and real-world product. And the main focus of ISM is really to find out if the field under investigation is a possible career field. ISM is meant to challenge students with working on a task that's applicable to the real world and prepare them for an independent learning that is more like the undergraduate college environment. So it's essentially preparing high school students with the skills and knowledge necessary to not only transition from high school to undergraduate school, but really thrive in that type of environment. ISM also equipped me with communication skills that really boosted my confidence to network with other individuals. For example, early in the year, I had the opportunity to network with Ms. Ivalis Meza-Gonzalez, who's the former chief of staff to the San Antonio mayor. And in addition to her talking about her graduating from St. Mary's Law School, she really told me about her efforts as a lobbyist, which I thought were very admirable. And then I also had the opportunity to talk to Mr. David Marchese, who is a 1L Harvard Law student. 1L simply means that it's your first year of law school. And when I talked to Mr. Marchese, initially it was a Baylor recruitment speech. He is a Baylor alumni, and he really wanted me to attend Baylor. but he also gave me great insight about what it means to be in a T14 law school. And just for context, a T14 law school is essentially the top 14 ranking law schools in the nation. And as you can imagine, Harvard is definitely on that list. But he gave me great insight about what it means to be a competitive T14 candidate. And what they're really looking for are individuals who shape themselves both academically, professionally, and socially. They don't want just someone who's hitting the books really hard and has their head in like their studies. They want someone who's able to translate the knowledge that they gain in the classroom into actual impact within their community. And now we can transition into my mentorship. I mentored under Mr. Eduardo O'Connell Valdez, who works for Gene Toscano Law Firm. He specializes in personal injury, and he is also a criminal attorney. Some fun facts about him is that he holds 4 degrees. He has a bachelor's in marine biology from UT, a bachelor's in Spanish from UT, a master's in environmental science from Stephen F. Austin, and a JD from St. Mary's University. Notice that he has a degree in marine biology and environmental science. That's because initially when he graduated law school, he thought he was going to be an environmental lawyer. However, after graduating from St. Mary's Law School, he realized that there's not much job opportunities for that. So he's quickly transitioned into becoming a criminal attorney and then civil. A couple more fun facts about Mr. Valdez is that he has a wife and 4 kids, one of whom is graduating middle school today, so that's why he's unable to attend. And then Mr. Valdez also enjoys fishing and watching sports, especially Real Madrid and Barcelona play soccer. Some might say football. Mentor meetings. So Mr. Valdez and I met approximately every other week. Most of our mentor meetings took place at Gene Toscano Law Firm, and I occasionally had the opportunity to visit the Bexar County Courthouse. When I visited his law firm, we normally just talked about legal concepts and important Supreme Court cases, but initially I remembered that I was very lost in the conversation in terms of legal jargon and legal terminology. And so I took it upon myself to conduct independent research so that I was more aware of the legal proceedings, and really we could just have more effective discussions. Some examples of the things that I was able to observe at Gene Toscano Law Firm were mediations and depositions. And a deposition is really just an opportunity for parties in a civil lawsuit to obtain testimony from a witness under oath prior to trial. So in simple terms, a deposition is really just getting testimony from a witness before it goes to trial. And then a mediation is the attempt to settle a legal dispute through active participation of a mediator who works to find points of an agreement. So it was really interesting to see how a mediation works. They're conducted via Zoom, and let's say Mr. Valdez was asking the opposing counsel to settle at $1 million, and the opposing counsel was only willing to settle at, let's say, $60,000. So it's really funny to see how they're really on opposite sides of the spectrum, but the mediator was eventually bringing them down from their extremes to a more reasonable middle ground, and that's really when they were going to decide whether or not the case was going to have to go to civil court. But personally, my favorite part of the mentorship was going to the Bexar County Courthouse to observe ongoing trials. For example, one of the trials that I observed was a personal injury case where Mr. Valdez's client needed hip replacement surgery and now has chronic back pain after the defendant caused a motor vehicle accident. And although Mr. Valdez lost that case, I found it very admirable how he was advocating on behalf of his client, and I was really excited just being there and watching him in action, and really at that moment I knew that this was meant for me. In terms of coursework, there's mentor journals, annotated bibliographies, and reflection journals. I'm briefly going to elaborate on each point. So coursework has 3 main purposes. The first one being just a reflection on mentor meetings. My mentor journal. One second. So this is my mentor journal. Before or during every mentor meeting, I would write chicken scratch here. These are my notes. And then the next day I would type up newly polished notes. So that's how this is a reflection journal. And I would really just try to document all the lessons that I learned. Some entries range from anywhere to 3 pages. Some I think were like 9 pages of typing. And it was really interesting through my mentor journal to see the progression of my mentorship, the relationship Mr. Valdez and I were able to build, and really just being able to see how I've become more familiar with the legal proceedings, and remember how I was kind of lost initially, but now I really feel like I have a better understanding of what civil law is per se. And if you're interested, check this out. Okay, and then Next are annotated bibliographies. This is an example of the independent research that I conducted. There was really 4 main categories that I analyzed in depth pertaining to the field of law. The first being occupational outlook. So this included the educational requirements of becoming an attorney, the annual salary, the responsibilities, then transitioning into ethics. One of the ethical issues that I researched was the increase in legal fees, and this actually causes groups to be marginalized, so the disadvantaged incomes, lesser incomes, don't have access to true legal justice due to the rise in legal fees. And then also several innovations within the field of law, studying the Code of Hammurabi, which was the first society to codify law, and then also monumental Supreme Court cases such as Gideon v. Wainwright, which was the first Supreme Court case to incorporate the 6th Amendment in accordance to the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, which basically means that individuals now have the right to counsel after this case. And then also patterns and trends. One of the most concerning trends that I saw within the field of law was really the lack of diversity. Hispanics only make up about 5.8% of lawyers in the United States. And obviously, as a Hispanic kid, I'm trying to change that number and maybe inspire a few kids to follow my path. And then reflection journals. This was mostly assigned by my teacher, and they had 3 main purposes. The first being encouraging professional development. So through these reflection journals, I was able to learn how to make a great first impression, learn how to write professional emails, which was very important. I feel like I've written so many emails this year compared to all the other years before. And then really, reflection journals were really an opportunity for me to just discuss how I was feeling throughout the year, and my classmates would respond to my responses via Schoology, which is the online platform that our school uses to post assignments and things of that nature. And it was great to get feedback from my classmates because throughout the year I can get very stressed, and they would give me tips on how to really de-stress and maybe how to effectively manage my time a little bit better. And then also, lastly, some of the assignments we were given were meant to provide thoughtful analysis on several intellectual topics, one of them being the increasing importance at major companies like Google in soft skills, which include empathy, emotional intelligence, and sociability. And really, at places like Google, you could have a brilliant software engineer, but they have no value to the company if they're just going to be within their own bubble and unable to work with the team. So really learning about the importance of soft skills and how can you strengthen them to be a more valuable employee at a company to really contribute to their progression. Okay, now we're going to get to the fun stuff. I'm going to provide a fun case study lesson. Would mom and dad actually please step forward? Yes. Okay, while they're coming to the front, I'm going to provide some context about this case study lesson. So I applied to a program known as Baylor to Baylor Law. You guys get to know. Thank you. Thank you, mom and dad. So I applied to a program known as Baylor to Baylor Law, and essentially what this program includes is a generous $40,000 undergraduate scholarship, in addition to automatic acceptance to law school, in addition to a full tuition scholarship to Baylor Law School. So I applied to this. Out of 850 candidates, I was selected as a finalist, meaning I was invited to a specialized campus visit, and at this visit I was able to participate in a Socratic seminar taught by Professor Stephanie L. Tang, reviewing the case Curtis v. Anderson. So today I'm going to mimic this case study because it really taught me a lot about what it means to be a law school student, and she also taught me how to take a case briefing, which can be very lengthy, and break it down into something more manageable and digestible to arrive at a conclusion. So that is what has just some context. Now let's get into the actual case study. Okay. So mom, you are now Michelle Anderson. And dad, you are now Michael Curtis. Congratulations. It's the summer of 2000 and you two are getting engaged. So dad, here's the engagement ring. Or Mr. Curtis, here's the engagement ring. So Mr. Curtis, please give Anderson the engagement ring. Now Ms. Anderson, no matter what I say, do not give the ring back. Okay. So as we said, it's the summer of 2000 and Mr. Curtis and Ms. Anderson are now getting engaged. However, approximately 6 to 8 weeks later, Curtis has decided to end the engagement. You guys are no longer going to be married. So now, Mr. Curtis, please ask your ring back. And what are you going to say, Ms. Anderson?
No.
So now, Anderson has now refused to return the engagement ring, and in desperation, Curtis has brought civil action against his former fiancée for breach of oral agreement and conversion. Now, in this civil suit, Curtis claimed that when he gave Anderson the ring, Anderson verbally agreed that she would return the ring if the engagement ended. So those are the facts of the case. If anybody gets lost, I have this hearing to provide a brief overview. Now, going back to the last fact, I think it's a very interesting point in the case because most of the time, whenever someone gets engaged, they don't really think, if it doesn't work out, are you gonna give me the ring back, right? But that's what Curtis claimed, and that's what we're going to believe since that is a fact of the case. And I digress. So now we have a legal dispute. Who is entitled to get the ring back? Do we have any opinions? Who should get the ring back? Is it Curtis, Anderson?
Nah.
Do
She
we
should
know,
keep it.
do we know that Curtis asked her for the ring back if they broke up?
It says in the case study that Curtis
That-
did ask,
okay.
and Anderson refused. So any beliefs on who's entitled before we break down the case?
How long into the marriage did they decide to?
It's an engagement, so,
Okay.
sorry, an engagement.
I think Curtis
Curtis?
wins.
I think
Okay.
Michelle just keeps it one right there.
It was a gift.
It was a gift.
It wasn't a gift.
No, Curtis.
No, it wasn't a gift.
Because marriage is a,
They're not married yet.
it's like a contract.
Yeah.
They're not married.
So
But
the
this is
contract is
engagement.
not,
It's
it's
engagement.
broken
Yeah,
in the
this is
beginning,
not a
so
contract.
he's entitled of the gift.
But this is an engagement, not a marriage.
But it's still, they haven't got the contract yet, so.
It's a rehearsal for
Yeah.
them.
Okay, so obviously I don't have enough time to provide everybody the case briefing, and that just would take way too long. So Professor Tang actually taught me a great skill on how to analyze a long case briefing, which is known as the golden rule, or IRAC. So issue, what is the court trying to decide? The ruling, what are the legal principles for this case? And then application, how are you going to apply the ruling to the facts of the case? And that will help you arrive at a conclusion. Now, whenever you analyze a case, it's always important to pick a side. Professor Tang told us that if you do not pick a side, the professor is gonna think one of two things. Either you didn't read it, or you did not understand it. So it's always important to pick a side. And the reason being, imagine if you have an attorney who's defending you, and if the court asks the attorney, well, how do you think this case is going to go? You don't want your attorney saying, well, I think it could go either way, right? You want someone who's gonna argue your case through and through. Okay, so as I said, I broke down the case briefing using the golden rule, and now we're gonna get into the two main components of this case. The first being Texas Family Code section 1.108. This is the issue. Now, what is the ruling? What does this say? This says that if there's an agreement on consideration of marriage, it is not enforceable unless the promise or agreement is in writing and signed. Okay, application, do you have the contract here?
I think I forgot.
Exactly. This is just an oral agreement, meaning it does not fall within the scopes of Texas Family Code section 1.108. So according to this, Curtis, you are not entitled to get the ring back. However, there is one more component that could potentially get you to win your ring back, and that is the conditional gift rule. This is the second issue of the case. Now, what is the ruling? What does it say? Well, first and foremost, it only applies if there is no binding agreement. Binding agreement meaning writing and signed. So in this case, there is no binding agreement, so therefore it's applicable so far. However, the conditional gift rule says that as the defaulting party, Curtis is not entitled to get his ring back. Now, in the state of Texas, there is a fault-based approach, meaning that if you are at fault for the engagement, you are not entitled to get your ring back. Traditionally, this applies to when the donee ends the engagement, so therefore the donor is entitled to get his ring back. However, in this case, the donor is at fault for ending the engagement, so therefore the donee is entitled to it. And then I basically gave away the conclusion. Curtis, you are not entitled to get your ring back. So this case that I briefly reviewed was a legal opinion from Justice Yi Yakel, who affirmed the trial court's judgment and denied Curtis's attempt to appeal, meaning that, as we discussed, Curtis was not entitled to get his ring back. And although I agree with the interpretation of the law, I fundamentally disagree with the law itself. And just to provide some context, there's currently a jurisdictional split in the United States on whether or not to consider fault when applying the conditional gift rule. Remember that the state of Texas has a fault-based approach. If anybody's getting confused, I have some definitions here, but a fault-based approach is essentially, if you're at fault, you are not entitled to get your ring back. However, I am advocating that Texas has a no-fault approach for 4 following reasons. The first, it's often difficult for a court to determine fault in a breakup. Breakups are very messy. If I were to break up with my girlfriend, wouldn't have to, but hypothetical. If I were to break up with her, I would say, well, I'm breaking up with you because of this. So even though it's my fault, I'm implying that it's really her fault, right? So breakups can be very messy. And secondly, engagements, I believe, are a period of evaluation, and marriage is a period of obligation. This is, right, you are obligating yourself to a person. But in this case, it's only an engagement, so you're therefore evaluating, like, do I really want to get married to this individual? And I do not think that a party should be penalized for ending a doomed relationship. I don't think that the court should penalize you if you ultimately decide that, you know what, I really can't spend the rest of my life with this person. And then thirdly, there's an underlying policy that favors no-fault divorce. This was just in the case study that I read. It says that oftentimes in the state of Texas, when someone gets a divorce, it is no fault. And I think that should be applied to engagements. And really this third point is just saying that it can be done. We can't switch to no fault. And lastly, I believe that the law should focus on objective truth. Handling a broken engagement with a no-fault approach really avoids addressing personal and emotional situations that are really subjective. If we were to get into who is at fault for a relationship, your opinion is often going to be skewed by emotions and other biases. And I think the law should focus strictly on objectivity and not subjectivity. Now, since this is a Socratic seminar, and the professor will normally call an individual, I'm still deciding who to call, but I need someone to give an argument for why Texas should continue to have a fault-based approach. Any volunteers before I call on someone as to why Texas should have a fault-based approach? No volunteers, I really don't.
You did such a good job, I already believe you.
Yeah, I don't want to argue you.
Yeah, I know, I don't wanna get on the other end of
That's the
that.
last thing I want to do.
Okay, well, I don't feel like calling anybody else. But
We trust you, we believe you.
But now that brings us, thank you, Mom and Dad. Round of applause for Mom and
Oh,
Dad. Okay, now we're gonna get into the product portion of ISM. Now, to be honest, this was the aspect of ISM that I struggled the most with, simply because I had a hard time finding an idea. When I was brainstorming, I really broke it down into two big ideas, either advertising or education. Advertising, because Mr. Valdez's law firm, Gene Toscano Law Firm, has no online presence. And most of his clientele comes from word of mouth and strictly his good reputation. However, Mr. Valdez and I discussed that if I were to start some sort of marketing campaign, that in his own words, I could find cases that have more meat on the bone. And then in terms of education, I thought, well, how could I utilize the information that I learned throughout my mentorship and create it to something and share it with other individuals, and what kind of impact would this information have, if any? Breaking down the advertising idea, I thought, well, maybe I could create a website or a blog to provide general information and recruit clientele for Gene Toscano Law Firm. Or maybe I could create a podcast that records a Q&A session between Mr. Valdez and I to cover common questions regarding the law. And then breaking down the education main idea, I noticed that the American Bar Association had teaching resources, and I thought, well, maybe I could utilize these resources and prepare a lesson for the youth to spark interest in the field of law. So thinking really, maybe I could create a fun, engaging lesson to shape someone in elementary school into someone like me who was always passionate about law. Going back to the lack of diversity within the field of law, I thought, well, maybe educating them early would spark their interest, and maybe we could start changing those statistics. And then this is a little bit off topic, but I'm passionate about educational policy, so I thought maybe I could review proposed legislation to reform education and evaluate its efficacy and feasibility. So really, a little bit off topic, something of my interest, but it didn't really align with the information that I learned throughout my mentorship. And lastly, I thought, well, maybe I could create a presentation that reviews general knowledge among teenagers, identifying their gaps in their knowledge pertaining to the law and legal terminology that's relevant to them, and then utilizing this survey, again, identifying gaps in their knowledge, and then creating a presentation tailored to those gaps. And when I was brainstorming all these ideas, I was really struggling because I had no passion about any of them. And when I do something, it's because I'm fully passionate about it. I envision a goal and I work towards that goal. I always work hard, 110%, but it's because I'm motivated by ambition and motivated by passion. And when I saw these ideas, I thought, well, they could be useful, but I'm not really passionate about any of them. And fortunately, this spark came in the Clark High School restroom. Just to provide some context, I'm an ESL tutor, so I go into Mrs. McFarland's classroom to teach English to her students. Her students are newcomers, so they've come from developing countries such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, and I help them tutor English. But I'm more than just a tutor, I also try to be their friend and a role model to help ease their transition from their home country into the States, where they're exposed to a new country, new language, new culture, and it can be a hard transition for them, but I really just try to be there during this time of transition. And I haven't told Ms. McFarland this story, but whenever I went to the Clark restroom, I saw one of those students who not mentor, but he's in the classroom as well. I saw one of those students hitting a vape or a THC pen. I didn't look at exactly what it was. I kept my head down because I didn't want this individual to get in trouble. So after I left the restroom, I was disappointed, and I'm really thinking about that student. I thought, well, there is a culture of vaping and using THC pens at Clark, so maybe are they doing that because they think that's what's cool? Do they really understand the gravity of that situation if they were to get caught? For example, if the pen has marijuana-derived extracts, that could be a felony. How would a felony play on their record if they're new into the country, if they're already struggling with their high school education? It would just be maybe a toll that would be too insurmountable. And now that I had this passionate spark, I decided what my final product was going to be. And so for my final product, I created a legal awareness presentation that extends legal education to youth surrounding topics such as vaping, alcohol, and police encounters, so that students can be well-informed citizens, aware of their actions' consequences, and how to respond appropriately in certain legal situations. So now that I had this desperately needed spark, I'm going to provide you all a product evaluation comparing how I envisioned the product to go versus how it actually turned out. And before I even started, I had an outline broken down into 4 main components. So at 25%, I thought I was going to create a survey that reviews essential laws and legal concepts relevant to teenagers. So really understanding what do students know and what do they don't know, and those gaps in knowledge could help me tailor my presentation into something that would be useful. And then at 50%, I was going to actually start working on the presentation, reviewing things such as drugs, alcohol, parties, vaping, police encounters. For example, a law relevant to teenagers about parties, for example, would be liability. So let's say that we have a cool mom who wants to host a teenage party, provides alcohol to minors, which is fine. However, if that student actually causes harm outside of the household, the parent who hosted the party could be found liable for those damages. So are students aware of that whenever they host teenage parties, things like that? And then at 75%, I had a personal goal for myself. I was going to have 50 responses to my survey, and then add on to my presentation cyberbullying, cell phone policies, and driving policies. And then lastly, I was going to conference with Mr. Zimmerman, our high school principal, about implementation. And then I also wanted to translate this presentation into Pashto and Spanish. So that way, regardless of where you're from, regardless of what language you speak, you could have access to this essential information. Okay. At 25%, I did exactly what I envisioned. I created the legal awareness survey. First and foremost, I had a disclaimer basically saying that I am not an attorney licensed in the state of Texas. I'm not providing you legal advice. I have no affiliation with a law firm, no affiliation to an attorney, so that way I am not liable for anything. This is strictly for informational purposes, and in order to take the survey, you had to basically accept the disclaimer. And then I had a wide variety of questions in my survey, including true or false questions, multiple choice questions, opinion questions, thermometer questions that were rated on a scale of 1 to 5, so 5 being strongly agree, 1 being strongly disagree. And this is a certain limitation of my survey, going back to the importance of objectivity. An ordinal scale, I believe it's called, is honestly subjective, right? Someone who feels strongly about something versus very strongly about something is subjective. That's definitely a limitation. But at 50%, I think it's fair to say dilemmas. I did have dilemmas at the 25% mark. Mostly, how do I distribute my survey? Should I leverage my NHS platform? To provide context, throughout the course of the school year, I had the opportunity to be NHS president, which is an organization of roughly 250 members. So at first I thought, oh, that's potential 250 responses. But I ultimately decided that my NHS platform and the things that I do in ISM are separate, and I should not leverage one to benefit the other. And then general improvements, I decided to create a flyer with the QR code, and I put it around school, asking teachers, will you please put it up in your classroom? And then I also added more identification or demographic information to my survey, including things like race, bilingual, if you're bilingual or ESL, if you qualify for free or reduced price lunch, and if you identify as gifted and talented, so really just getting more data on the demographic that I was surveying. And then at 50%, I think it's fair to say I exceeded my personal goal of 50 responses. And now I'm just gonna go over some key takeaways of this survey. So 92.8% of students, all students who participated in the survey were from Clark High School. 92.8% of them thought that it was either very important or at least important to know their legal rights and potential consequences for breaking the law. So this right there validated a little bit of what my final product was going to be, that students want to know their rights and their consequences. Only 65.5% of students knew that vaping under 21 is illegal, which I think only 65% is a relatively small number. And then 41.7% knew that a Class A misdemeanor is more severe than a Class C misdemeanor. Now, why is this important, right? This is really just to identify gaps in information. So when I create my presentation, and the first slide may say, oh, this is a Class A misdemeanor offense, and the next slide is gonna say Class C misdemeanor offense. What this told me is that students don't really understand the difference in severity of these charges, so I had to take that into consideration whenever I was going to continue with actually creating the presentation. This was probably the most concerning statistic that I saw personally. Only 15.8% of students knew that the criminal charges for marijuana-derived extracts are harsher than if you just had regular marijuana. So what does this mean? Let's say I'm a rebel student who enjoys recreational marijuana. From a legal standpoint, it's actually better to carry the plant itself than a pen that has marijuana-derived extracts. Well, why? If you get caught with a pen that has marijuana-derived extracts, that's automatically a felony. However, if I had the plant, I need a lot of it for it to be a felony. And this is especially important at Clark High School because you could find THC pens everywhere. Passing periods, during, before school, I mean everywhere. So I don't think that students realize that they are carrying around a felony. So that was very important for me personally. And then also, I provided a definition of reasonable suspicion, and then I asked, is this enough for a search warrant or arrest? Only, 18.7% of students knew that reasonable suspicion is not enough for an arrest. Now, why is this important? Let's say that someone gets into an interaction with a police officer, and they say, I have reasonable suspicion to believe that there's drugs in your car. Well, this student may automatically start getting nervous, and this might ease tension between the two, both the civilian and the police officer, when really it's just a temporary detention to evaluate whether or not the individual has actual drugs. It doesn't mean you're going to get arrested. And I think this is a very important teaching point because especially when you see the controversies between individuals and the police brutality, controversy over defunding the police, I think that simple education like this could really help ease tensions. And then amendments, I simply just asked students, what's the Fourth Amendment? What rights do they give you? As you can see, poor accuracy across the board. And then also, I provided a definition of what legal awareness was. Everybody got the same definition, and I asked, do you believe that your school has provided you enough information for you to be legally aware? And only 9.4% of students believe that the school has done a thorough job of this. And then lastly, arguably, depending who you ask, the most important question, do you believe your school should provide presentations that enhance legal awareness? The vast majority, 81% of students said, yes, I think this would be very helpful. 14.4% of students said, I don't really care. And then there was other responses saying that, well, it's gonna be boring. Nobody would pay attention. Again, I don't think anybody would pay attention. And this is a certain challenge that I had to face. How am I going to make this presentation both informational and engaging? How am I gonna get students to even care, right? So I had to think about that going forward. And then now I'm going to show the legal awareness presentation that I had at 50%. Now going into this presentation at 50%, I really just thought about just the content. So it's not necessarily visually appealing, but I wanted to make sure that I had all information within this presentation. And I'm really just gonna go through a brief rundown. So again, the disclaimer, very important, I do not want to get sued. A definition of how the state of Texas defines vaping. It's important to note that this presentation is strictly objective. It's not me imposing an opinion. Everything is backed by sections in the Texas Health safety code. So again, how does the state of Texas define vaping or e-cigarette? Vaping is illegal for citizens under 21. Now, for some individuals, this may be obvious. However, you have to realize that I'm also thinking about students who are new to the country. So what might be obvious for one individual may be new information for another. And then the legal consequences of vaping, alcohol. So again, the minimum age is 21. Hopefully everybody knows that. Zero tolerance law. If you have any sip of alcohol and you're under the age of 21, you're not allowed to drive in the state of Texas. The most important point here is going back to liability. Again, if you are a cool mom who wants to host a teenage party, just know that you could be held liable for the damages because you are technically providing alcohol to a minor. And then different types of police encounters. So this was backed by a handbook that Mr. Valdez gave me. Let's see if I have it here. I utilized this handbook here. And it broke down, did a nice job breaking down the different types of police encounters. Again, I think that this information can be very important going back to the controversies we see between civilians and the police departments. There's really three main types of interactions, the first being a voluntary encounter. And this essentially means that as long as you feel free to walk away or ignore the police officer, that's what a voluntary encounter is. It does not implicate the Fourth Amendment. For example, let's just say I wanted to walk up to a random police officer. That's an example of something voluntary. And then we have detention. For example, this is when you get pulled over by a police officer for speeding, and this is just in order to gather more information about whether there is criminal activity. So an officer needs reasonable suspicion in order to have a temporary detention, and then in order to get to probable cause, that's when you can make an arrest. And then Miranda rights. This was the question that I asked in my survey. It had poor accuracy like all the other questions, basically telling students that you only get Mirandized if you get arrested, and this is what your Miranda rights tell you. A list of drugs, going back to the distinction between marijuana and marijuana-derived extracts. So as you can see, it starts as a Class B misdemeanor if you have any amount of marijuana. However, with THC, it automatically starts as a state jail felony. That's a very important distinction to make, especially at Clark High School. And then utilizing this presentation, I went to Mr. Zimmerman, who is the Clark High School principal, and I was really concerned that he was going to dismiss my email, so I loaded it with a lot of information and utilized the information that I gained from the survey, basically saying that there is a need for this type of presentation. Please, if possible, could we schedule a meeting? And he agreed, and although he did agree that there is a need for this type of presentation, we disagreed on what laws to review. I wanted to essentially review laws relevant to the outside world beyond school. However, he wanted me to focus more on the Northside Student Code of Conduct, more in-school consequences. And the reason I did not want to do that is because whenever you get in trouble at school, the path of discipline is the same. So let's say I have a vape, you either get suspended, expelled, and then sent to alternative. If you have marijuana, you get either suspended, expelled, or sent to alternative. It's the same pathway. However, in the real world, there's a differing severity of consequences. And although I did not agree with Mr. Zimmerman on focusing on the Student Code of Conduct, I thought, you know what, I'm willing to compromise because there really is a need for this type of presentation. And some key pointers he gave me was to make it more visually appealing, which I thought was fair. That was a little bit of a dry presentation. He referred to it as legalese. And then he also said that I need to keep it 12 slides at max because students just don't care anymore at a certain point. And then also, I need to only focus on vaping, alcohol, drugs, and police encounters, so that essentially nullified the 50% or the 75% and 100% of my timeline. So dilemmas, I needed to pivot my project, again, focus less on outside consequences and more on in-school consequences. But that was okay because there was potential for it to be adopted by the school. Mr. Zimmerman said that he was willing to work with me for this if we implemented at Clark High School. And then also, a big dilemma I had was really just the lack of digital design skills that I possess. I'm not very creative when it comes to that. As you can see in the green presentation, it's pretty dry. So at 75%, I was really just focusing on learning the Student Code of Conduct, and then also trying to make it a little bit more visually appealing. I hope I did a nice job. Believe it or not, this slide took me maybe 40 minutes because I'm just not very good at it. And the biggest dilemma I had at 75% was really just managing my time. there was other projects that I was participating in, whether it was NHS or just outside things that I was doing. For example, I'm starting to prepare for the LSAT exam, which is the entry level exam to law school. And it's really early, but I thought, why not? And then AP exams, I had AP exams during that time, so just preparation for the 5 that I had to take. And then I also had a hard time balancing, again, in-school consequences versus out-of-school consequences. I needed to make it visually appealing, but I also didn't want to sacrifice necessary information. I only had 12 slides that I could use, so I was struggling trying to find a balance between, okay, how do I make this visually appealing and not overloaded with information that I want to put on there? So I needed to cut out some information, obviously. And then I also had an opportunity, coincidentally, to speak with Northside board members who are both here today. Thank you, Dr. Harl and Ms. Karine Saldana. I really appreciate you guys taking time out of your day to listen to me. And that was a great improvement. And then I think it's fair to say that I did get some better digital design skills compared to the green presentation. And then now I'm going to review what the completed product is now. Okay. So I try to make it a little bit more tailored to Northside. Northside ISD is blue. And then the general template of this presentation was first identifying what a substance is and then elaborating on the consequences. So just defining, I believe this is from the Student Code of Conduct, the definition of an e-cigarette, and then also talking about health consequences. And then for vaping, I decided to focus only on in-school consequences. And again, important to note that vaping is legal for a person under the age of 21. And then marijuana, defining what marijuana is. This is an important definition because again, we're going to define the distinction between marijuana and marijuana-derived extracts. So marijuana, this is in-school consequences, basically saying that if you have any amount of marijuana, you may be expelled. Maybe, keyword maybe. And then marijuana-derived extracts, again, defining the distinction between marijuana and marijuana-derived extracts. A key difference in terminology, automatically a student shall be, meaning there's no possibility you are going to be expelled if you have a pen that has marijuana-derived extracts. And then comparing in-school or out-of-school consequences, really showing students that if it's an automatic felony, which is very important at Clark High School. Then alcohol, talking about the minimum drinking age, the zero tolerance law, and then just reviewing general health consequences, both short-term and long-term, if you decide to indulge in alcohol. And then in-school consequences. This mostly applies to students who decide to drink before, like a football game, for example, that is still against district policy. And then in-school searches. So this is really an important point because unlike the real world where an officer needs reasonable suspicion, a student essentially has no rights in school. And a school official can search you really at any time they choose. And I think that's important point to make to students is that you might think you're slick, but at the end of the day, like a school official could search you at any time and it's not against the law. And then really, I think this is an important point to make. What is at stake? What happens if you get charged with a felony? What happens if you just have something on your record? And again, it could disrupt your educational journey because being sent to alternative, you may not have the same electives, the same coursework. And then job opportunities. I was actually talking to Mr. Zimmerman, and he said that even he gets phone calls about college graduates about how they were as a student in high school. So your records can really go along with you even after college. And then this is also an important statistic to make that a lot of colleges do consider your disciplinary record when making an admissions decision. So again, just really informing students about not only the consequences, but the long-term consequences about what does having something on your record really mean. Okay, that's the last slide for that presentation. And I met with Mr. Zimmerman actually yesterday, and after showing him this presentation, he agreed that Clark High School will now be utilizing it for years to come. So essentially, from this point forward, every student at Clark High School will be presented this on a yearly basis. And I think there is a potential for Northside to adopt this. I think this should be maybe possibly a district-wide presentation because it really is important information, just so students are really aware of the consequences. And I'm not naive enough to say that all students are going to stop vaping or using vapes, but I think it's just providing them this information could really make them think twice about their actions. Okay, final reflection on my presentation. ISM did a lot for me. This was my favorite course by far. It really provided me experiential learning, so not just writing notes and as PowerPoint, it was really just going into the field and learning from a mentor and just on something that I'm very passionate about. And it was just, I know Mr. Valdez isn't here, it's recording. Thank you, Mr. Valdez. It was really a lot of fun and very informative. And then also, I was able to enhance my communication skills. I think now during the digital era, a lot of students just engage through their phone, but really meeting with Mr. Valdez forced me to strengthen those interpersonal skills. And then I also have a strengthened interest in law. After this mentorship, or before this mentorship, I thought, well, there could be a possibility that even though I've aspired to be a lawyer since I was little, once I actually mentor an attorney, I could think, well, maybe this isn't for me. But that wasn't the case at all. I did not have that thought at once. And it really provided me a new perspective about what being an attorney is. Some people may have different perceptions about it, thinking that depending who you ask, they're liars or just rich people who don't really care, it doesn't matter. But for me personally, an attorney is someone who utilizes their education and their JD to make an impact in someone else's life. And I think that that's really what I want to do for my career. And then lastly, ISM really helped me with my problem solving skills, whether it was trying to schedule a mentor meeting. Mr. Valdez is a very busy individual. I think it's fair to say sometimes I can be as well. So just scheduling conflicts, being able to work around them, and then also, as I talked about several dilemmas during the product development, how do I overcome them? And I think it's fair to say that I have a nice product after all those different obstacles that I had to overcome. And then, even though ISM is not the only thing it's not the only aspect of who I am as a student, it definitely opened up a lot of opportunities in terms of scholarship and college applications. Right here, the United States Senate Youth Program, although I didn't win, I still want to talk about it. In the state of Texas, I was designated as the first alternate for the state of Texas in the United States Senate Youth Program, which is a fancy word of saying third place. But when I applied to this program, I was nominated by the school, and I applied thinking, it's a state competition basically, and I was selected as a finalist, so I was top 6 in the state of Texas. I interviewed, and I ended up getting third. The first 2 individuals actually went on to meet the President of the United States, Supreme Court justices. So I was so close, but I was the first student from Northside to be recognized by the Texas Education Agency for this recognition, so I still think that it's an honor to even be recognized among those high achieving students. And then also, the Baylor to Baylor Law Program, I actually won that scholarship, so again, $40,000, automatic acceptance to law school, and a full tuition scholarship to law school. And then Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Scholarship, I think I won this about a week ago. I was recognized by the city of San Antonio, given $10,000, and it was an honor to be chosen. However, despite all these schools, I decided to stay home and go to UTSA to be part of the Top Scholar program. The QR code, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but the reason I chose UTSA is really the Top Scholar program. When I applied, I honestly thought UTSA was going to be the last place I was going to go. I always said I'm going to go to school anywhere but San Antonio. But when I visited the campus and went on a specialized tour for Top Scholars, I was chosen as a finalist candidate then out of, I believe, 250 students. And I conducted my interview, I toured the campus, but what really left a profound impact on me was during the banquet dinner, I sat next to President Amy, and he introduced himself to me. He knew my name, he asked me about the things that I had participated in at school, and it really made me think like, wow, there's really no other place where the president of the university is gonna know my name and actually care what I have to say and know what I've done. And that really sealed the deal for me in terms of where can I thrive in my undergraduate space, and I really think that UTSA is the place for me to do that. And then my digital portfolio, this is essentially, the QR code is on the paper that I provided you guys, just really reviewing some recent highlights, my resume, extracurriculars, some more awards and achievements, a showcase of some of the projects I worked on at school, and then my information about my independent study mentorship. You can find my mentor journals digitally, my annotated bibliographies, and then also you can have access to the Legal Awareness Initiative, all the presentations, things like that. And then even though Mr. Valdez is not here tonight, still thank you, Mr. Valdez, for everything. I genuinely appreciate it. And then are there any questions or general comments before we conclude this presentation?
So proud of you, dear.
Aw. You know, you were talking about, I think it was in your written notes, your book of lessons learned, right? What was your greatest lesson learned in this whole experience? Like if that was an essay to get into college or something, what was your greatest lesson learned?
Well, really just providing a perspective on what a lawyer is. So going back to watching Mr. Valdez in the courtroom, just advocating on behalf of his client, seeking just compensation, and just watching him really taught me that it's more than just the money you make, it's more than just the things you learn, it's really about how can you utilize that knowledge towards making an impact in someone else's life. So that's really the biggest lesson I learned, for sure.
I think you had that in you early on though.
Oh, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you guys for being here. I really appreciate it. We're excited. Oh, the English. What's my time? So now. Yes.